On September 8, 1944, a sound came from the sky over Chiswick that made no sense to anyone who heard it, a low, distant roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, climbing in pitch and intensity until it filled the evening air with a howl that was almost mechanical, almost organic, and then, without warning, it stopped. In that sudden silence, which lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, perhaps 5, the people on the street froze, some looking up, some instinctively crouching, and then the world came apart in a flash of light and a pressure wave that tore through buildings and bodies with the indifferent efficiency of a hurricane made of steel and fire. When the dust settled and the ringing in their ears subsided enough to think, those who survived realized they had witnessed something unprecedented, something that violated every assumption they had made about how war was supposed to work, because there had been no warning, no air raid siren, no drone of approaching aircraft, no chance to take cover or prepare, just that terrible roar and then obliteration. And in the days that followed, as more of the weapons fell on London and the surrounding counties, a new kind of terror took root, one that had nothing to do with courage or cowardice, but with the fundamental helplessness of being targeted by something against which there was no defence. The weapon was called the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the Vengeance Weapon 2, or V-2, and it was, in every meaningful sense, the world's first ballistic missile, a rocket 46 feet tall and weighing nearly 14 tons, powered by liquid oxygen and ethanol, capable of climbing to an altitude of 50 miles before arcing down toward its target at speeds approaching 3,000 miles per hour, faster than sound itself, which meant that it arrived before its own noise, so that the roar of its passage was heard only after the explosion, a reversal of causality so disorienting that it seemed almost supernatural. For the people of southern England, who had endured 4 years of bombing, who had learned to recognize the sound of aircraft engines and the whistle of falling bombs, who had developed elaborate rituals of warning and response, the V-2 represented a collapse of all that hard-won knowledge, because there was nothing to recognize, nothing to respond to, just sudden, arbitrary death falling from the stratosphere with no more warning than a lightning bolt. The psychological impact was profound and immediate, not just among civilians, but among the military and political leadership who understood, perhaps better than anyone, what the weapon represented in terms of strategic implications. This was not merely a more powerful bomb or a faster aircraft. It was a weapon that bypassed all existing defences, that rendered obsolete the entire apparatus of anti-aircraft guns and fighter interceptors and early warning systems that had been painstakingly constructed over the course of the war, and if the Germans had developed it earlier, if they had produced it in greater numbers, if they had managed to fit it with a nuclear warhead, as some reports suggested they were attempting, the outcome of the war might have been very different. Intelligence officers who examined the wreckage of the first V-2s were stunned by the sophistication of the technology, by the gyroscopic guidance system, and the fuel injection mechanisms, and the aerodynamic design that allowed it to function at altitudes where the air was too thin to support conventional flight, and they recognized immediately that they were looking at something that represented not just an incremental improvement in weaponry, but a fundamental leap, a glimpse of a future in which distance and geography would no longer provide any protection, in which any point on the Earth's surface could be struck within minutes by a weapon launched from half a world away. The British attempted to maintain public morale by referring to the V-2s as flying gas mains, encouraging people to believe that the explosions were caused by accidents in the city's infrastructure rather than enemy action. But the ruse was transparent and short-lived, and the truth spread through whispered conversations and coded newspaper reports. And with the truth came a kind of fatalism that was different from the defiance that had characterized the earlier phases of the Blitz. There was no point in listening for sirens, no point in scanning the sky, no point in running for shelter, because by the time you knew the rocket was coming, it had already arrived, and so people went about their daily routines with a kind of stoic resignation, knowing that they might be vaporized at any moment, and that there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. The Germans launched over 3,000 V-2s during the final months of the war, targeting not just London, but Antwerp, Brussels, Paris, and other cities across Western Europe. And while the total number of casualties was lower than that inflicted by conventional bombing campaigns, the psychological toll was incalculable, because the V-2 represented a violation of the unspoken rules of warfare, the implicit understanding that there should be some relationship between danger and warning, between threat and response, some opportunity, however small, for the targeted to defend themselves or at least to prepare. The rocket eliminated all of that. It was violence in its purest, most abstract form, delivered with mechanical precision and utterly divorced from human agency, because the men who launched it were hundreds of miles away, and the men who built it had never seen the cities it would destroy, and the trajectory it followed was determined by mathematics and physics rather than intention or malice, so that being killed by a V-2 felt less like being murdered and more like being struck by a meteor, an act of cosmic indifference rather than human cruelty. Engineers and scientists who worked on countermeasures found themselves confronting problems that had no clear solutions, because the rocket travelled too fast to be intercepted, climbed too high to be targeted by anti-aircraft fire, and left no signature that could be detected by radar until it was already descending. And even if they could somehow track its launch, the trajectory was so steep and the speed so great that there was no time to issue warnings or evacuate the impact zone. Some proposed bombing the launch sites, but the V-2s were mobile, fired from trucks that could be moved and hidden with relative ease, and the vast network of factories and assembly facilities that produced them was spread across occupied Europe, protected by distance and secrecy and the crumbling but still formidable defences of the Third Reich. Others suggested that the only real defence was to advance the ground war as quickly as possible, to overrun the launch sites and capture the production facilities before more rockets could be fired, and this became, in the final months of 1944 and the early months of 1945, a strategic priority that influenced the conduct of the campaign, because every V-2 that fell on London or Antwerp was not just a military loss, but a political one, a demonstration that the war was not yet won, that the enemy still possessed the capacity to strike at the heart of the Allied nations with impunity. The men who operated the V-2 batteries were, for the most part, technicians rather than soldiers, specialists in rocketry and guidance systems who understood the theoretical principles behind the weapon but had little concept of the human cost of their work, and this distance, this abstraction, was itself a kind of shock factor, because it represented a new paradigm of warfare in which the act of killing was mediated by technology to such an extent that it became almost clinical, devoid of the visceral immediacy that had characterized combat since the beginning of human history. There were no dogfights, no trench raids, no face-to-face confrontations, just men in white coats consulting charts and calculations, adjusting dials and flipping switches, and then, hundreds of miles away, buildings collapsed and people died, and the connection between cause and effect was so attenuated, so indirect, that it was possible for the technicians to convince themselves that they were not really killing anyone, that they were merely solving engineering problems, launching projectiles according to the laws of physics, and whatever happened at the other end was not their responsibility. This moral dislocation, this ability to inflict mass casualties without ever seeing the victims, would become one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare, a legacy of the V-2 that would echo through the decades that followed, through the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles and strategic bombers and drone strikes, all of which built upon the fundamental insight that distance could be weaponized, that killing could be rendered impersonal, that technology could create a buffer between the act of violence and the psychological consequences of that act. For the Allied forces who finally overran the V-2 production facilities and launch sites in the spring of 1945, the experience was surreal because they found themselves walking through vast underground complexes where tens of thousands of slave laborers had died assembling the rockets, examining blueprints and technical documents that described weapons of such sophistication that they seemed to belong to a different era, a future that had somehow manifested in the present, and they understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the war they had just won was the last of its kind, that the rules of engagement had changed irrevocably, that the next conflict, if it came, would be fought with weapons so destructive and so unstoppable that the very concept of victory might become meaningless. In the years immediately after the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to capture German rocket scientists and technical documentation, and the V-2 became the foundation for the space programs and missile arsenals of both superpowers, a legacy that transformed the geopolitical landscape and created the conditions for the Cold War, because the lesson of the V-2 was not just that rockets could be used as weapons, but that they could be used to deliver warheads of unimaginable power across distances that rendered all previous notions of security obsolete. The shock factor of the V-2, then, was not just immediate and tactical, but long-term and strategic, a demonstration that the future of warfare would belong not to those who could field the largest armies or build the most ships, but to those who could master the technologies of speed and precision and range, and that, in such a future, there would be no safe places, no rear areas, no distinction between soldier and civilian, because the weapons themselves would not discriminate, would not pause to consider the morality of their targets, would simply follow their programmed trajectories with the inevitability of falling rain, and that anyone, anywhere, at any time, could find themselves standing in the impact zone, hearing that terrible roar that came too late to matter, watching the sky open up and swallow them whole.